The Untold Story of Google's Rise. A comprehensive journey from Stanford dorm to global technological powerhouse. Executive summary. Google's rise from a Stanford University research project to the world's dominant technology company represents one of the most remarkable entrepreneurial stories of the 21st century. This document explores the lesser-known aspects, pivotal decisions, and transformative moments that shaped Google's extraordinary trajectory. From the humble beginnings in a friend's garage in Menlo Park to becoming a company worth over $1 trillion, Google's journey is filled with untold stories of innovation, strategic vision, calculated risks, and organizational excellence that fundamentally transformed how humanity accesses and processes information. The genesis. A fateful meeting at Stanford University. 1.1. Two visionaries collide. The story of Google begins not with a grand vision or a well-funded startup pitch, but with a chance encounter at Stanford University in 1995. Larry Page, a computer science doctoral candidate, was touring the Stanford campus to decide whether to pursue his graduate studies there. Sergey Brin, already a Stanford PhD student in computer science, was assigned the seemingly routine task of showing Page around campus. By all accounts, the two disagreed about nearly everything during that initial meeting, yet their contrasting perspectives would ultimately complement each other in building one of history's greatest companies. What made this encounter significant was not the immediate camaraderie between the two founders, but rather their shared fascination with the emerging internet and its fundamental problems. In 1995, the World Wide Web was experiencing explosive growth, but existing search engines were woefully inadequate. The leading search engines of the time, including AltaVista, Yahoo, and Lycos, primarily relied on keyword matching and metadata analysis, resulting in search results that were frequently irrelevant and cluttered with spam. Both Page and Brin recognized that this represented a massive opportunity to revolutionize how people found information online. 1.2. The Academic Foundation. By 1996, Page and Brin had begun their partnership in earnest, working initially from Page's dormitory room at Stanford. They started with a concept that seemed almost heretical at the time. What if the importance of a web page could be determined not by keywords it contained, but by the number and quality of links pointing to it from other pages? This insight would become the foundation of the PageRank algorithm, arguably the most important innovation in search engine history. The intuition behind PageRank was elegant and grounded in academic principles. Page had observed that academic citations worked similarly. Papers that were frequently cited by other researchers were typically more important and influential than those with few citations. He reasoned that the web could be analyzed using the same principle. A website with many high-quality links pointing to it was likely more authoritative and relevant than a site with few incoming links. This simple yet revolutionary idea would set Google apart from every other search engine on the market. 1.3. Building Backrub, the search engine with a strange name. Initially, Page and Brin named their search engine Backrub, a reference to the backlinks that formed the core of their algorithm. They filled Page's dormitory room with powerful computers, sourced from various locations, extracting spare parts to build machines capable of handling their search operations. The hardware setup was cobbled together from inexpensive components, demonstrating early resourcefulness that would characterize Google's engineering culture. They connected these machines to Stanford's broadband network and began indexing web pages. The Backrub system quickly grew in popularity among Stanford students and faculty, who appreciated the dramatically improved search results compared to alternatives. However, this success created an unexpected problem. The search engine was consuming so much bandwidth on Stanford's network that it began causing performance issues for the entire university's computing infrastructure. The university's IT administrators pressured Page and Brin to move their project off campus, inadvertently forcing them to take the first step toward commercialization. 1.4. The first search and the naming decision. An oft-told but significant detail about Google's early days concerns the first search query ever entered into the Google system. That query was Gerhard Casper, the president of Stanford University at that time. Page and Brin deliberately chose this query as a test to verify that their system worked correctly, and crucially, that it would return better results than their competitors. When Google correctly returned Casper's Wikipedia page and official university biography, while competing search engines like AltaVista returned results for the ghost character Casper from the animated films, it provided compelling proof of their engine's superiority. The name Google itself emerged from what was almost a mathematical inside joke. The word derives from Google, a mathematical term representing the number 1 followed by 100 zeros, coined by American mathematician Milton Serrata in 1920. Page and Brin chose this name to represent their ambition to organize the seemingly infinite amount of information on the World Wide Web. Additionally, Page created the iconic Google logo in 1998 using the free graphics program GIMP, modifying the typeface and adding an exclamation mark to subtly mock Yahoo's similar design choice. Interestingly, the exclamation mark was later removed from the logo, though the playful competitive spirit remained. 2. The Garage Years. Building a company from nothing. 2.1. The Menlo Park Garage and Susan Wojcicki's role. In 1998, with Stanford's network no longer available and their project demanding more resources, Page and Brin made a fateful decision. They would leave Stanford and start a company. However, they lacked the capital to secure traditional office space. Enter Susan Wojcicki, a Stanford alumna and former marketer at Netscape Communications, who would play a crucial but often overlooked role in Google's founding. Wojcicki owned a small house in Menlo Park, California, and agreed to rent her garage to Page and Brin for $1,700 per month, a sum that was far from trivial for the bootstrapped entrepreneurs. This garage, which included a remote control for the garage door, a washing machine, dryer, and a hot tub, became the birthplace of Google Inc. The cramped quarters forced Page and Brin to be creative with their resources. They installed a door to separate the search engine infrastructure from the living space and began recruiting their first employees. The garage setup became iconic in Silicon Valley lore, joining the ranks of other legendary startup origins like Apple and Hewlett-Packard. Yet it represented more than just nostalgia. It embodied the scrappy, resource-efficient ethos that would define Google's early culture. 2.2. The first employee and corporate infrastructure. In the crucial early days, Google hired Craig Silverstein as its first employee, making him employee number 1 in what would become the world's most valuable technology company. Silverstein's decision to join Page and Brin was significant, as he represented the first external validation of their vision. His background and skills complemented the founders perfectly, and he would remain with Google for more than a decade, contributing to the company's development during its most critical growth phase. When Silverstein eventually left in 2012, he had amassed a personal fortune estimated at around $950 million, validating the wisdom of his early commitment to the venture. Even with limited resources, Page and Brin recognized the importance of establishing formal corporate infrastructure. On September 4, 1998, Google was officially incorporated as Google Inc., with a registered domain name derived from Google. The founders initially appointed Larry Page as CEO, while Sergey Brin held the title of co-founder and president. This division of responsibilities, formalized from the beginning, would establish a pattern of leadership structure that persisted through Google's expansion. 2.3. The seed funding round and angel investors. The transformation from a two-person operation to a company with ambitions to change the world required capital. In 1998, Page and Brin began seeking investment to fund their growth. The first significant capital came through angel investors who recognized the potential of their technology. Andy Bechtolsheim, co-founder of Sun Microsystems, provided a $100,000 investment that was literally written on a check, making him an exceptionally important early backer. This check was dated August 16, 1998, and while Bechtolsheim never officially became a board member, his early belief in Google's potential helped establish credibility with other investors. The founders also raised approximately $1 million from family, friends, and other angel investors, including venture capitalist Ron Conway and technologist Sriram. This seed funding, while modest by later standards, was sufficient to allow Google to establish more formal operations, hire additional staff, and improve their technological infrastructure. The bootstrapped nature of these early funding rounds demonstrated Page and Brin's ability to inspire confidence, despite the company having no revenue and existing in a market already crowded with established competitors. 3. The venture capital inflection point. 3.1. The rivals who became partners. By 1999, Google had grown beyond what early angel investments could support. The company needed serious venture capital to compete effectively and expand its reach. However, Google faced an unusual situation. The two most prominent venture capital firms in Silicon Valley at the time were intense rivals who rarely worked together on the same investments. Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers and Sequoia Capital had been competitors for decades, each jealously guarding their investment territories and rarely collaborating. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, demonstrating shrewd business judgment at a remarkably young age, insisted on receiving investment from both firms simultaneously. This decision reflected their confidence in Google's potential and their belief that they deserved the caliber of venture partners that typically competed for exclusive access to promising startups. The founders' insistence on dual investment was reinforced by earlier angel investors Ron Conway and Sriram, who used their connections and credibility to mediate between the two competing venture firms. The result was unprecedented. Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia each committed $12.5 million in funding for a total Series A investment of $25 million announced in June 1999. This joint investment not only provided Google with the capital it needed to scale operations, but also sent a powerful signal to the market. The fact that these two typically rival firms were willing to partner on Google suggested the investment community believed the company represented a generational opportunity. Michael Moritz from Sequoia Capital and John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins Caulfield and Byers joined Google's board of directors, bringing not just capital, but also operational expertise and Silicon Valley networks. 3.2. The board, the ping-pong table, and governance. An amusing but revealing detail about Google's early governance emerged from this period. The company's board of directors initially conducted their meetings around a ping-pong table rather than a formal conference table. This unconventional setting reflected Google's informal culture and the scrappy nature of the organization, even as it was scaling. The ping-pong table board meetings symbolized that Google, despite receiving a substantial venture capital investment and bringing on experienced venture capitalists, maintained its startup mentality and cultural informality. The involvement of seasoned venture capitalists like Doerr and Moritz proved invaluable as Google navigated the complexities of rapid scaling. These experienced board members helped the company think strategically about product development, market positioning, competitive threats, and the eventual path to profitability and public markets. Their guidance during the turbulent dot-com period of 1999 to 2000, when many internet companies were either collapsing or pivoting dramatically, helped Google maintain focus on its core mission of providing superior search results. 3.3. The rejected offers and Google's independence. A remarkable and often overlooked aspect of Google's early history involves the acquisition offers it received and decisively rejected. In 1998, Yahoo's founders offered Page and Brin $1 million for their search technology and the Google search engine itself. At a time when Google was still running from Page's dorm room and working to solve basic infrastructure problems, $1 million represented substantial wealth. The fact that the founders rejected this offer demonstrated either prescience or audacity, or perhaps both. The rejection of Yahoo's offer was particularly significant because it would not be the last such overture. In later years, as Google's power grew, Yahoo actually reversed course and attempted to acquire Google for $3 billion. But by then, Google's founders believed their company was worth far more and refused. This arc, from being offered $1 million and declining it, to later rejecting a $3 billion offer, illustrates how dramatically circumstances changed and how the founders' vision for Google's potential proved validated. Other companies also attempted to acquire Google during this period. The company that came closest to purchasing Google was Excite, another major search engine. However, Excite's founders rejected the offer to acquire Google, a decision that proved disastrous for Excite, but validated Google's founders' belief in their company's potential. These repeated rejections of acquisition offers set a pattern. Page and Brin were building a company for the long term, not for a quick exit. 4. Competing against giants, the search wars of the early 2000s. 4.1. Alta Vista, the forgotten rival. To understand Google's rise, it is essential to understand the competitive landscape it was entering. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Alta Vista was one of the most prominent and influential search engines, often viewed as a serious contender for dominance of search. Founded by Digital Equipment Corporation in 1995, Alta Vista had become popular by offering a vast index of web pages and what was then considered advanced search capabilities. The search engine had features like Boolean search operators and language filters that appealed to power users. However, Alta Vista had a critical weakness. Its search results were not as relevant as Google's. Alta Vista's ranking, algorithm relied heavily on keyword density and meta tags, which meant websites could manipulate their rankings through spamming techniques. Additionally, AltaVista's user interface was cluttered with advertisements and complex options that overwhelmed many users. In contrast, Google's PageRank algorithm and minimalist interface delivered clearly superior results to typical user queries. Furthermore, AltaVista struggled with scalability and accuracy as the Internet expanded. The company faced technical difficulties, challenges in maintaining the quality of its search index as the number of web pages grew exponentially. When users began noticing that Google consistently returned more relevant results than AltaVista, market share shifted dramatically. By the early 2000s, Google had surpassed AltaVista, and the once prominent search engine faded into obscurity. Digital Equipment Corporation eventually sold AltaVista, and it was ultimately shut down entirely, representing a complete reversal of fortunes compared to Google's exponential growth. 4.2. Yahoo! The directory versus the algorithm. Yahoo presented a different but equally important competitive challenge. Yahoo had been founded in 1994 as a web directory, a manually curated catalog of websites organized by category, more similar to a library classification system than a search engine. For several years, Yahoo remained the most popular web portal, leveraging its early mover advantage and strong branding. However, as the web grew exponentially, the directory model proved unsustainable. Yahoo could not possibly maintain a manually curated index of the billions of web pages being created. The company gradually shifted toward using search engine technology, but by then, Google's superior algorithm and branding had established clear superiority. Yahoo's attempt to counter Google's dominance by investing in search technology and even attempting acquisition came too late. An intriguing element of the Google-Yahoo relationship involves a lesser-known detail. Yahoo actually became one of Google's largest distribution partners. As Yahoo struggled to build its own search technology competitively, it licensed Google's search results to power its own search functionality. This meant that even when Yahoo users thought they were using Yahoo's search engine, they were actually receiving results powered by Google's superior algorithms. This arrangement, while lucrative for Google, further consolidated Google's market dominance. 4.3. MSN Search and Microsoft's challenge. Microsoft, recognizing the strategic importance of search in the emerging web economy, launched MSN Search, later Bing, as another challenge to Google's dominance. With Microsoft's vast resources and technological expertise, the company represented a formidable competitor. However, despite significant investment and marketing resources, Microsoft struggled to match Google's search quality and brand recognition. Google's combination of superior technology, PageRank, and its continuous improvements, user-friendly interface, and excellent products. First-mover advantage in establishing search as the default entry point to the web proved insurmountable. While Bing, Microsoft's later rebranding of MSN Search, achieved some market share and served as the default search engine in Microsoft's Internet Explorer and Edge browsers, it never approached Google's dominance. By the early 2000s, it was clear that Google had won the search wars. 5. The business model revolution, from free search to advertising dominance. 5.1. The chicken and egg problem, scale without revenue. One of the most critical challenges Google faced in its early years was the classic startup dilemma: how to build a sustainable business when giving away the core product for free. Google's search engine was extraordinary, but it generated no revenue. Meanwhile, the company was paying for servers, bandwidth, and salaries. The venture capital funding from Kleiner Perkins and Sequoia provided runway, but it was clear that Google needed to develop a monetization strategy or face inevitable extinction as funding rounds grew harder to secure. The challenge was particularly acute because many internet companies were failing precisely because they could not figure out how to monetize their offerings. The dot-com crash of 2000 to 2001 had demonstrated that eyeballs without revenue was not a viable business model. Google, despite its technical superiority and growing user base, faced the same fundamental question. How could a search engine that was free to users generate revenue? 5.2. The AdWords Insight. Text-based advertising. The breakthrough came not from Page and Brin directly, but from the broader Google team and the company's growing understanding of user behavior and advertising economics. Google's developers realized that search queries represented an incredibly valuable signal. They indicated what users were interested in at that specific moment. Rather than selling banner advertisements that appeared to random users, what if Google could sell targeted text-based advertisements that appeared only when users searched for relevant terms? This insight led to the development of AdWords, Google's revolutionary advertising platform. Unlike the banner advertising that dominated web advertising at the time, AdWords ads were simple, text-based, and highly targeted. An advertiser selling used cars, for example, could bid to have their ad appear when users searched for used cars or car dealers near me. Google would only show ads when they were relevant to user queries, which meant higher click-through rates for advertisers and better user experience for Google's search engine users. Critically, Google pioneered an advertising model based on a victory auction, where advertisers bid competitively for ad placements, but only pay one bid increment above the second highest bid. This mechanism ensured efficient allocation of advertising slots while preventing single advertisers from dominating all ad placements. The auction-based model also meant that Google's revenue was not limited by its willingness to sell ads, but by advertiser demand and the value they perceived in reaching targeted audiences. 5.3. AdSense and the network effect. While AdWords provided a powerful monetization mechanism, it only generated revenue from searches on Google's own website. The company's next innovation, AdSense, initially called content targeting advertising, extended the advertising model to partner websites across the internet. This was a genuinely innovative idea that created an entirely new revenue stream. The concept behind AdSense was elegant. Partner websites could display Google's contextually targeted advertisements on their pages, and Google would share revenue with the site owners. For example, a technology blog could display ads for software products. A cooking website could display ads for kitchen equipment. The ads would be relevant to each site's content, improving user experience, while Google and the partner site would share the revenue. AdSense launched in March 2003 and scaled up after Google acquired the company Applied Semantics, which had developed similar technology in April 2003, created a powerful network effect. Suddenly, Google's advertising network extended across millions of partner websites. Small publishers and website owners could monetize their content without building their own advertising sales organizations. Google could expand its reach to display ads wherever relevant content existed on the internet. An interesting historical note: Paul Buchheit, who later created Gmail, initially proposed running ads within Google's email service. But it was Susan Wojcicki, the woman who had rented Google the Menlo Park garage, who organized the team that developed AdSense into the enormously successful product it became. Wojcicki's contribution to AdSense's development, often overlooked, was instrumental in creating one of Google's most profitable revenue streams. 5.4. The path to profitability. Google achieved profitability remarkably quickly by Internet standards. The company became profitable at the end of 2001, just 3 years after its founding, and during the depths of the dot-com crash, when most Internet companies were collapsing. By the first half of 2004, Google's profits exceeded $143 million, a staggering figure that demonstrated the power of the advertising model, combined with Google's technological superiority. The profitability breakthrough was significant, not just for financial reasons, but because it validated the business model and gave the company independence from venture capital financing. Google was no longer burning through investor funds. It was generating cash that could fund its own growth and development. This transition from a capital-dependent startup to a cash-generating business fundamentally changed Google's strategic position and gave founders Page and Brin greater freedom in decision-making. The executive leadership transformation. When Google brought in Eric Schmidt. 6.1. The adult supervision era begins. By 2000, Google's founders Page and Brin were in their late 20s, possessed of brilliant ideas and technical expertise, but lacking experience in running a large organization. Early investors and board members, while impressed by the Page and Brin's capabilities, recognized that scaling Google from a promising startup to a major company would require operational expertise in areas like finance, sales organization, and corporate governance. In March 2001, Google recruited Eric Schmidt to serve as chairman of the board. Later that year, in August 2001, Schmidt was promoted to chief executive officer. Schmidt's background was impeccable. He had previously worked at Sun Microsystems, rising to the position of president of Sun Technology Enterprises, and had served as CEO and chairman of Novell, a major software company. Schmidt brought operational discipline, industry connections, and corporate experience that complemented the technical genius of Page and Brin. The arrangement, with Schmidt handling CEO responsibilities and business operations while Page and Brin focused on product and strategy, proved highly effective. The three-person leadership model. The recruitment of Eric Schmidt established a leadership structure that would define Google for over a decade. A collaborative three-person executive team consisting of Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Eric Schmidt. Rather than the typical structure where a single CEO exercises centralized authority, Google's model distributed responsibilities across 3 leaders, with distinct expertise and domains of influence. Schmidt's role, as Google would later describe it, involved building the corporate infrastructure needed to maintain Google's rapid growth as a company and on ensuring that quality remains high while the product development cycle times are kept to a minimum. In practical terms, this meant Schmidt focused on management of vice presidents, sales organization, finance, and corporate governance, while Page and Brin maintained focus on product development, strategic vision, and technological innovation. This three-person model proved surprisingly effective. It created built-in checks and balances while allowing Google to benefit from Schmidt's operational experience and network, without surrendering control to an external executive who might impose an alien corporate culture. The arrangement also set a pattern for Google's future leadership transitions, demonstrating the company's ability to bring in experienced leaders while maintaining the founder's involvement and influence. 6.3. Schmidt's impact on Google's growth. Under Schmidt's leadership, Google expanded from a search engine company to a diversified technology organization. Schmidt oversaw the preparations for Google's eventual initial public offering, managed relationships with major customers and partners, and helped establish the corporate governance structures necessary for public company operations. When serious antitrust concerns began to emerge, particularly regarding Google's dominance in search, Schmidt led the company's interactions with regulatory authorities and lawmakers. Schmidt remained in the CEO position until January 2011, when he stepped down to become executive chairman, a role he held until 2017. In a memorable Twitter post announcing his transition, Schmidt wrote, "Day-to-day adult supervision no longer needed." This characterization, while tongue-in-cheek, reflected the maturity Google had achieved and the confidence that Page and Brin had regained in leading the organization. When Schmidt transitioned out of the CEO role, he received a $100 million equity award, reflecting Google's appreciation for his leadership contributions. Free. Product innovation and expansion. Beyond search. In 2004, Google engineer Paul Buchheit, who had joined Google as one of its earliest engineers in 1999, proposed an idea that at first seemed tangential to Google's core search mission. A free email service like Hotmail, owned by Microsoft, and Yahoo Mail offered only 25 megabytes of storage, requiring users to regularly delete emails. Buchheit envisioned Gmail, a browser-based email service that would offer 1 gigabyte of storage, 500 times more than existing competitors, with advanced search capabilities and a revolutionary conversation-based interface. Google's leadership was initially skeptical. Email seemed far removed from Google's core competency in search and the list. Storage costs associated with providing 1 gigabyte per user seemed economically irrational. However, Buchheit persisted in developing Gmail, and it launched on April 1, 2004. Strategically timed on April Fool's Day, many users initially assumed Gmail was an elaborate prank. The unprecedented 1 gigabyte of storage, combined with a sleek interface and advanced search, quickly convinced users that Gmail was a genuine product worth using. The launch strategy for Gmail was particularly clever. Rather than immediately opening Gmail to everyone, Google released it as an invite-only beta service. This created an air of exclusivity and scarcity that drove demand. Some Gmail invitations reportedly traded for hundreds of dollars on secondary markets, as users clamored for access to the revolutionary email service. Within a few years, Gmail became the world's most popular email service, a position it has maintained for nearly 2 decades. Today, Gmail has over 1.8 billion active users, making it one of the most widely used internet services in the world. The strategic importance of Gmail extended beyond email itself. Gmail's invitation-only launch, combined with its integration with Google's other services, created a powerful mechanism to increase user engagement with Google's ecosystem. Email users who logged into Gmail would be logged into their Google account, making it easier to access other Google services. Gmail's success demonstrated Google's ability to innovate beyond search and expand its dominance across multiple categories of Internet services. 7.2. Google Maps and Geographic Information. In February 2005, Google launched Google Maps, a web-based mapping and navigation service that would prove transformational for geographic information services. Unlike traditional mapping services that were static, Google Maps was interactive, allowing users to zoom, pan, and search for locations. The service was built on technology acquired from Where2 Technologies, a Sydney-based company that had developed mapping software. Google's acquisition of Where2 brought the Rasmussen brothers, Lars and Jens, and other talented developers into Google. Google's development of Google Maps was closely followed by other geographic information acquisitions. In September 2004, Google acquired Keyhole, a geospatial data visualization company, notably with investment from the CIA. Keyhole's Earth Viewer application would evolve into Google Earth, a dramatic new way to visualize the planet. The company also acquired ZipDash, which provided real-time traffic analysis, adding a dynamic dimension to mapping. By combining these technologies, Google created an integrated platform for geographic information that was far more powerful and comprehensive than competitors could match. Google Maps' Street-Level Street View feature, introduced in 2007, took geographic information to new levels of detail. While Street View did generate privacy concerns, discussed later in this document, it provided unprecedented visibility into the world's streets and landmarks. 7.3. Google Images, Google News, and Product Expansion. Beyond email and maps, Google rapidly expanded its product portfolio in the early 2000s. In 2001, Google introduced Google Image Search, allowing users to search for images on the web. Google News, launched in 2002, initially called Google News Beta, aggregated news stories from multiple publishers and ranked them algorithmically, creating a novel way to consume news. Each of these product launches followed a similar pattern. Google identified an existing internet functionality, search for images, aggregation of news, and improved it through superior technology and user interface design. Google didn't necessarily invent image search or news aggregation, but Google's versions were systematically better than competitors' offerings. This pattern of innovation, not always pioneering, but consistently improving on existing ideas, became characteristic of Google's approach. 7.4. Google Scholar and Google's expansion into academia. Launched in 2004, Google Scholar represented an interesting expansion into academic and scholarly research. Google Scholar provided a specialized search interface for scholarly literature, including peer-reviewed papers, theses, books, and other academic materials. Rather than trying to compete with established academic databases like Thomson Reuters Web of Science, Google Scholar offered free access to a broader index of scholarly content. Google Scholar's development was influenced by Sergey Brin's background in computer science and his familiarity with academic research. The service included citation counting, beginning in 2006, and scholar profiling features, creating a new way to evaluate and discover research. While academic institutions and librarians had mixed feelings about Google Scholar, appreciating its breadth while sometimes questioning its accuracy, it undeniably expanded access to scholarly information for researchers worldwide. The hidden gems, lesser-known Google projects and failures. 8.1. Google Desktop Search, Conquering Your Computer. In March 2005, Google launched Google Desktop Search, a free downloadable application that allowed users to search for information stored on their own computers. At a time when desktop search was an emerging category, Google's version was distinctive for its comprehensiveness. It could search full text of PDFs, music files, video metadata, and even web page history. Google Desktop Search also provided API access, allowing developers to build applications on top of the service. Google Desktop Search represented an interesting strategic move. It extended Google's search capabilities from the internet to individual computers. While Google Desktop Search never achieved mainstream adoption, partly due to privacy concerns and the rise of cloud-based computing, it demonstrated Google's intention to make search ubiquitous across all information sources. 8.2. Google Wave, the ambitious failure. Not all of Google's innovations succeeded. Google Wave, announced at Google I/O 2009, was an ambitious real-time communication and collaboration platform that attempted to combine email, instant messaging, and document collaboration into a unified interface. Wave was conceptually innovative, allowing users to have real-time conversations, share documents, and collaborate synchronously. However, Google Wave failed to achieve significant adoption. Users found the interface confusing, the value proposition unclear, and the concept too ambitious. Within approximately 1 year of launch, Google announced that Wave would be discontinued. The failure of Google Wave demonstrated that even Google, with its resources and technical expertise, could not force adoption of products that didn't meet clear user needs or achieve product-market fit. 8.3. The Google Notebook and other experiments. Google's innovation labs regularly produced experiments and tools that achieved varying levels of success. Google Notebook, a web-based note-taking application, Google Catalogs, and various other services were launched and sometimes discontinued. These experiments reflected Google's 20% time culture, where engineers could spend 20% of their working time on projects of their own choosing. Many of these experiments never reached mainstream adoption, but they represented important learnings about user needs and market opportunities. The willingness to experiment, fail, and learn from failures became embedded in Google's organizational culture. 9. Google Chrome and the Browser Wars. 9.1. A new entry into the browser market. In September 2008, Google made an unexpected move by releasing Google Chrome, a web browser developed by Google. The browser market at the time was dominated by Microsoft's Internet Explorer, which had over 80% market share, Mozilla Firefox, and Apple Safari. Introducing a new browser seemed like an unnecessary distraction from Google's core business of search and advertising. However, Google's strategic rationale for Chrome reflected deep thinking about the future of the Internet. Google's executives recognized that as more computing moved to the web, the performance and capabilities of web browsers would become critical infrastructure. If users had slow, crash-prone browsers, the web-based applications that Google was developing and hoped to develop further would struggle. By creating Chrome, Google was building a browser optimized for modern web applications, particularly Google's own services. 9.2. The performance advantage. Chrome's initial advantage was primarily performance. The browser was fast, particularly for loading complex web applications. Google's developers had engineered Chrome to start quickly, load pages rapidly, and handle multiple tabs efficiently. The initial marketing slogan, 99 tabs and not a single one crashing, reflected the browser's superior stability compared to Internet Explorer, which was notoriously crash-prone. Chrome's underlying architecture contributed to its performance advantages. Unlike Internet Explorer and early versions of Firefox, Chrome used a multi-process architecture where each tab and extension ran in a separate process. This meant that if one tab crashed or hung, it didn't bring down the entire browser or affect other tabs. This architectural innovation proved crucial to Chrome's eventual success. 9.3. Chrome's rapid market adoption. Despite entering an established market as a late entrant, Chrome achieved remarkable growth. Within 9 months of its official launch, more than 30 million people were using Chrome. By the end of 2010, Chrome had grown from 40 million users at the beginning of the year to over 120 million. Today, Chrome is the world's dominant web browser, with over 60% of the global browser market share. Chrome's success reflected several factors: superior performance, integration with Google services, and particularly, the prevalence of Chrome as the default browser in Android devices. As Android's adoption grew globally, Chrome adoption followed. By making Chrome central to Android, Google ensured that its browser would reach billions of users. 10. YouTube, the $1.65 billion acquisition that changed everything. 10.1. The opportunity Google couldn't ignore. On October 9, 2006, Google announced its acquisition of YouTube, an online video sharing platform, for $1.65 billion in stock. The acquisition was shocking to many observers. YouTube, while growing rapidly, had been operating for less than 2 years and had no clear path to profitability. At a time when many companies paid roughly the same or less to acquire entire established businesses, paying $1.65 billion for a startup with no revenue seemed insanely expensive. Yet, Google's founders and leadership recognized something that many skeptics missed. Video would become central to the Internet's future. YouTube's technology for uploading, storing, and streaming video, combined with its rapidly growing user base, represented an opportunity to position Google at the center of video consumption on the Internet. Additionally, Google recognized that YouTube represented a new platform for advertising, where video ads could reach enormous audiences. The competitive bidding war. The YouTube acquisition was actually the culmination of a competitive bidding process. According to accounts from people involved in the negotiations, nearly half a dozen companies expressed interest in acquiring YouTube, including Microsoft, Viacom, and News Corporation. However, the competition effectively narrowed to 2 serious contenders, Yahoo and Google. An interesting detail emerges from the YouTube acquisition story. The final negotiations took place in unusual circumstances. David Drummond, Google's general counsel, and Gideon Yu, YouTube's CFO, famously held late-night negotiations in a Denny's parking lot in Redwood City, California, where they finalized the merger agreement. Police officers driving by initially became concerned about the unusual late-night activity before Yu showed the officers the merger documents, at which point the officers essentially gave them permission to proceed. YouTube's transformation of Google. The YouTube acquisition proved to be one of Google's most successful strategic moves. Today, YouTube generates nearly $31 billion in annual revenue as of 2023, representing roughly 10% of Alphabet's total revenue. This single acquisition has directly contributed hundreds of billions of dollars in value to the company. More broadly, YouTube transformed Google from a search and advertising company into a media and technology platform. The acquisition gave Google a direct relationship with content consumers, not just content providers. It created opportunities for new advertising formats, video advertising, new partnership arrangements, and entirely new revenue streams. The YouTube case study also demonstrated Google's willingness to make bold, expensive bets on strategic opportunities, even when conventional wisdom questioned whether the acquisition price was justified. The $1.65 billion price tag, once viewed as excessive, now appears to have been among the greatest bargains in technology acquisition history. 11. The Android acquisition, the $50 million decision that rewired the industry. 11.1. A mobile operating system for the future. While Google was building its dominance in search and web services, a separate but ultimately equally important acquisition was taking shape. In 2005, Google acquired Android Inc., a small company that had been developing a mobile operating system for approximately $50 million. This acquisition, like YouTube, would prove transformative, though for different reasons. Android Inc. had been founded in 2003 by Andy Rubin, who had previously worked at Microsoft and Apple. Rubin had received the nickname Android from colleagues at Apple who appreciated his love of robots. The company's initial aim was to develop an operating system and platform for mobile devices, recognizing that the future of computing would increasingly involve mobile and handheld devices. 11.2. Android's early struggles and near collapse. Android Inc.'s journey prior to Google's acquisition was filled with challenges. The company struggled financially and came dangerously close to failing entirely. At one critical juncture, Rubin's friend and investor Steve Perlman, recognizing that Android was on the verge of running out of money, physically withdrew $10,000 in cash from a bank and gave it to Rubin. This cash infusion, though relatively small, provided Android Inc. with enough runway to continue operations and eventually attract Google's interest. The fact that a company requiring a mere $10,000 cash injection to survive would eventually be acquired by Google for $50 million and prove worth hundreds of billions to Google illustrates the timing and fortune involved in technological disruption. Had Rubin not been able to secure that $10,000, or had Perlman not been willing to provide it, Android might have disappeared before Google recognized its strategic value. When Google acquired Android Inc. in July 2005, though the news wasn't made public until August, it was making a bet on mobile computing's strategic importance. Google's founders recognized that mobile devices would eventually become the primary way most people accessed the internet. While search and advertising had been built around desktop web browsers, mobile represented a new frontier. By acquiring Android, Google obtained not just technology, but also a talented team of engineers and a complete operating system. Over the next 3 years, Google's engineers, building on Android Inc.'s foundation, developed the first public version of Android, which was released in 2008 on the T-Mobile G1 HTC Dream. This was the first Android smartphone available to consumers. In retrospect, the $50 million acquisition of Android Inc. may have been Google's most successful investment in terms of return on investment and strategic impact. Today, Android dominates global smartphone operating systems, with approximately 70% of global market share. Billions of people worldwide use Android devices, making Google's advertising network accessible on mobile platforms in ways that would have been impossible without Android ownership. 12. Corporate culture and values. Don't be evil, and Google's philosophy. 12.1. The origin of "Don't Be Evil." Google's corporate motto, "Don't be evil," has become one of the company's most iconic expressions. Yet the origin story, during Google's early days, when the company was establishing its corporate values and code of conduct. One account credits Google engineer Amit Patel with first writing "Don't be evil" on a whiteboard in the lower left corner of a conference room in tiny letters during a meeting before a business discussion with the Washington Post. The phrase was meant to remind colleagues of the company's values and commitment to operating with integrity, even as the company began monetizing its search engine. Another account, provided by Paul Buchheit, the creator of Gmail, holds that he suggested "Don't be evil" during a meeting specifically focused on developing Google's code of conduct and core values. Buchheit has noted that he wanted to propose something that, once embedded in the company's values, would be hard to take out. The slogan was also, Buchheit acknowledged, intended as a bit of a jab at competitors who, in Google's estimation, were exploiting users. The philosophy behind the motto, whatever the precise origin, "Don't be evil" captured a genuine philosophical commitment at the heart of Google's founding. The phrase appeared prominently in Google's 2004 IPO prospectus, in a letter from founders Larry Page and Sergey Brin. "Don't be evil. We believe strongly that in the long term, we will be better served as shareholders and in all other ways by a company that does good things for the world, even if we forgo some short-term gains." This statement represented a departure from some Silicon Valley companies' philosophies, which prioritized profit maximization above other concerns. Google's founders were articulating a belief that ethical conduct and societal benefit were not incompatible with financial success. Indeed, they believed long-term success required commitment to broader societal good. The "Don't be evil" philosophy influenced Google's product development, business practices, and corporate culture. It reflected in decisions like maintaining a relatively uncluttered search interface, rejecting the temptation to fill it with advertisements, storing users' search histories to improve results while giving users tools to manage that data, and approaching competition based on product superiority rather than predatory practices. 12.3. The tension between philosophy and practice. Over time, however, tensions emerged between Google's stated philosophy of "Don't be evil" and some of its actual business practices. As the company grew more powerful and faced increasing regulatory scrutiny, questions arose about whether Google was living up to its founding values. Issues related to privacy, antitrust concerns, search neutrality, and conflicts of interest between Google's advertising business and its search results led critics to argue that Google was not fully adhering to its stated principles. In 2015, when Google restructured and created Alphabet Inc. as its parent holding company, the new holding company adopted the motto, "Do the right thing," rather than "Don't be evil," representing a subtle but significant shift in language. In 2018, Google quietly removed "Don't be evil" from the preface to its code of conduct, though the phrase was retained at the end of the document. These changes reflected both the company's evolution and questions about whether the original motto remained meaningful as Google's business had expanded in complexity. The path to the IPO, going public. 13.1. The reluctant publicization. By 2003, Google had become a dominant force in search and internet advertising. The company was extraordinarily profitable for its size and was attracting extraordinary levels of investor interest. However, Larry Page and Sergey Brin were initially reluctant to take Google public. The founders valued their control over the company and feared that public markets would pressure the company to prioritize short-term profits over long-term innovation and societal benefit. The decision to pursue an IPO was driven more by circumstance and investor demand than by the founders' enthusiasm. As Google's value became increasingly apparent and early investors sought liquidity, an IPO became inevitable. However, Page and Brin were determined to structure the IPO in a way that would preserve their control and long-term vision. 13.2. The Dutch auction and the unusual IPO structure. Rather than following the conventional IPO process, where investment banks set the offering price through negotiations with institutional investors, a process that often results in significant first-day price increases and profits for institutional investors, Google decided to use an unusual Dutch auction process. In a Dutch auction, prospective investors bid for shares at various price points, and the offering price is set at the highest price at which all shares can be sold. This approach was revolutionary for IPOs. It was designed to democratize the IPO process, allowing individual investors to participate in bidding alongside institutional investors, and to prevent the large first-day price jumps that typically happens, benefited institutional investors at the expense of the company. Google management, particularly Eric Schmidt, believed this process would result in a more stable stock price and would prevent significant money being left on the table, raising approximately $1.67 billion and valuing Google at more than $23 billion. On the first day of trading, the stock rose to $100, yielding an 18% gain for IPO investors. However, this first-day increase was far smaller than the typical technology IPO first-day gains, reflecting the success of Google's Dutch auction structure in capturing more of the IPO value for the company, rather than allowing it to accrue to institutional investors. By the end of the first day of trading, Google's market capitalization exceeded that of established companies like AT&T, Xerox, and Radio Shack combined. Sergey Brin and Larry Page each became billionaires on paper, with holdings worth approximately $3.9 billion each. Other early employees and investors, including Eric Schmidt and others who had been part of the company during its growth, became extraordinarily wealthy. The roundup marked an inflection point in Google's history. The company was now answerable to public shareholders and subject to SEC regulations and reporting requirements. However, Page and Brin had managed to preserve significant control through the structure of their stock ownership. They retained supervoting shares that provided greater voting power than regular shares. This structure would allow them to maintain influence over Google's strategic direction even as the company became a massive public corporation. 14. The Alphabet restructuring, from Google Inc. to Alphabet Inc. 14.1. The diversification challenge. As Google's core search and advertising business matured, the company found itself increasingly investing in moonshot projects that were far removed from search. Autonomous vehicles, Waymo, health-related initiatives, Calico, and Verily, high-speed internet, Google Fiber, drone technology, Project Wing, and numerous other experimental ventures. These projects required significant capital investment and had uncertain paths to profitability. Yet they represented Google's belief that major innovations could emerge from ventures beyond search. By 2015, these diverse ventures had grown to the point where they were becoming materially significant to Google's financial statements and strategic focus. Investors and analysts struggled to value Google when the company, encompassed both a highly profitable search and advertising business, and numerous loss-making experimental ventures. This diversification, while reflecting Google's ambitions, created confusion about what Google actually was and how its financial performance should be assessed. 14.2. The Restructuring Announcement. On August 10, 2015, Larry Page announced a sweeping corporate restructuring that would address this challenge. Google would create a new parent holding company called Alphabet Inc., which would contain Google as one subsidiary along with other businesses. This restructuring would allow each business to operate with greater independence, while making transparent the financial contribution of each business unit. Under the new structure, Google would retain its traditional core businesses: Search, YouTube, Android, Gmail, and other core internet products. Meanwhile, Waymo, autonomous vehicles; Calico, health and aging research; Verily, life sciences; Google Fiber, broadband internet; X development, moonshot projects; Nest, smart home technology, and other ventures would be organized under Alphabet's umbrella, but operate as separate businesses with their own leadership and boards. 14.3. Leadership changes and Sundar Pichai's rise. The restructuring also involved significant leadership changes. Larry Page became CEO of Alphabet Inc., while Sundar Pichai, Google's senior vice president in charge of product, became CEO of Google. Sergey Brin became president of Alphabet Inc., and Eric Schmidt took the position of executive chairman of the holding company. Sundar Pichai's elevation to CEO of Google was particularly significant. Pichai, who had joined Google in 2004 and had led the development of Chrome and other critical products, represented a new generation of Google leadership. Unlike Page and Brin, who were founders, or Schmidt, who was brought in from outside, Pichai had grown up with Google and embodied the company's technical culture and innovative spirit. The strategic rationale: restructuring offered several strategic advantages. First, it provided transparency to investors about Google's different business units. The profitability of Google's core business became apparent when not obscured by losses in experimental ventures. Second, it allowed for flexibility in how capital was allocated across businesses and how each business was valued. Third, it prepared Google for potential regulatory pressures regarding antitrust concerns by creating formal separation between different business lines. 15. International expansion and global dominance. 15.1. Google's early international strategy. While Google was becoming dominant in the United States, the company simultaneously pursued an aggressive international expansion strategy. Early international offices were established in places like Tokyo, Japan in 2002, representing Google's ambition to establish a global presence. The company recognized that much of the Internet's future growth would occur outside the United States, particularly in developing economies with large populations and growing Internet adoption. Google's international expansion faced various challenges, including regulatory requirements to comply with local laws, competition from locally focused search engines, and the need to adapt services to local languages and cultural preferences. However, Google's superior technology and user experience typically allowed it to overcome these obstacles and capture substantial market share globally. 15.2. Navigating local regulations and censorship issues. Google's international expansion also involved navigating complex regulatory environments. In China, for example, Google initially agreed to comply with the Chinese government's censorship requirements in order to access the Chinese market. However, as Google expanded its services in China, the company became increasingly uncomfortable with requirements to censor search results and cooperate with government surveillance. In 2010, Google made the controversial decision to redirect its Chinese users to its uncensored Hong Kong servers, effectively reducing its mainland Chinese operations. This decision reflected a commitment to Google's "don't be evil" principles, even at the cost of market share in a potentially enormous market. 15.3. Google's global infrastructure. Supporting Google's global reach required massive infrastructure investments. Google built data centers around the world to ensure that services would load quickly for users, regardless of their geographic location. The company invested heavily in undersea cable networks to provide international bandwidth. These infrastructure investments, while expensive, were necessary to maintain Google's competitive advantage in delivering fast, reliable services globally. 16. Privacy, regulation, and controversy. 16.1. Google Street View and privacy concerns. While Google's innovations generally were celebrated, not all of them were universally welcomed. Google Street View, the feature of Google Maps that provided 360-degree panoramic street-level imagery, generated significant privacy concerns. Launched in 2007, Street View photographs streets in cities around the world, making the images available to anyone accessing Google Maps. Privacy advocates objected strenuously to Street View. In some images, individuals were identifiable, potentially exposing their locations. Street View also raised questions about whether homeowners had consented to having their homes photographed and displayed online. Various countries and jurisdictions responded differently to Street View. Some required Google to provide advance notice, while others required Google to blur faces and license plates, and still others launched formal investigations. Notably, Switzerland sued Google over Street View privacy concerns, and the United Kingdom's Privacy International organization filed formal complaints. Google eventually agreed to implement privacy protections, including blurring faces and license plates. But the Street View controversy highlighted tensions between Google's drive for comprehensive data collection and individuals' expectations of privacy. 16.2. Search neutrality and antitrust concerns. As Google's dominance in search grew, regulatory authorities worldwide began scrutinizing whether Google was using its data, search dominance, to unfairly favor its own properties like Google Maps, Google News, or Google Shopping in search results. The European Commission launched an extensive investigation into Google's search practices, ultimately imposing significant fines for what regulators believed were anti-competitive practices. These regulatory actions reflected a broader concern about Google's market power. Once the company had achieved dominance in search and had used its search platform to enter adjacent markets, maps, news, email, etc., questions arose about whether Google's dominance in search unfairly advantaged its services in other markets. Google argued that including Google services prominently in results reflected their superiority to competitors, and that users benefited from the integration of services. 16.3. Data privacy and user information. Google's business model relies fundamentally on collecting information about users' searches, web browsing, through Google Analytics and Google Ads, location, and other data. This data collection, while enabling Google to improve its services and target advertisements effectively, raised concerns about privacy and user information security. Debates ensued about what data Google was collecting, how it was being used, who had access to it, and whether users had adequate transparency and control over their information. These privacy concerns intensified following revelations about government surveillance programs and the extent to which technology companies, including Google, cooperated with government requests for user data. Google's responses to privacy concerns evolved over time, including providing users with tools to manage their data and increase transparency about government data requests. The Google I/O Developer Conference, Building the Ecosystem. 17.1. The birth of the Developer Conference. In 2006, Google held its first Geo Developer Day, a small conference focused on Google's then-new Google Maps API. This initial developer event, with only approximately 100 attendees, was held at the Googleplex and marked the beginning of Google's efforts to build a developer community around its platforms. By 2007, the developer event had grown and was rebranded as Google Developer Day, hosted at the San Jose Convention Center with approximately 1,000 developers. Interestingly, it wasn't until 2008 that the event received its now iconic Google I/O branding, with the name standing for Input-Output, but also Innovation in the Open. 17.2. Google I/O's Evolution and Impact. Google I/O evolved into Google's flagship annual developer conference, held at San Francisco's Moscone Center West. The first official Google I/O in 2008 featured approximately 2,500 developers from around the world. The event became notable not just for announcements and technical sessions, but also for dramatic product announcements and the unveiling of new developer tools. At the first Google I/O in 2008, Google unveiled the Android operating system to developers, demonstrating a prototype Android phone with Google Maps Street View running on the device. This demonstration, where a presenter held the phone and spun around with it showing the Street View imagery responding in real time, impressed the assembled developers and foreshadowed Android's eventual dominance. 17.3. The Developer Ecosystem Strategy. Google I/O reflected a broader strategic focus on building developer ecosystems around Google platforms. By providing tools, APIs, and infrastructure that developers could build upon, Google ensured that third parties would create applications and services that enhanced Google's ecosystem. This developer-centric approach was critical to Android's success and to the expansion of Google services beyond what Google employees alone could build. Google Translate and Global Communication. 18.1. Breaking down language barriers. Google Translate, launched in April 2006, represented another example of Google applying its technological capabilities to solve a human problem. Machine translation had existed for decades, with mixed results, often producing awkward or incomprehensible translations. Google's approach to translation was to apply statistical machine translation techniques to a vast corpus of translated documents, including United Nations and European Parliament documents. The initial version of Google Translate, while imperfect, was substantially better than previous machine translation systems. Critically, Google's approach made translation free and widely available to anyone with internet access. This democratization of translation technology had profound implications for global communication. 18.2 Evolution and Expansion. Over time, Google Translate expanded to support hundreds of languages and dialects. In November 2016, Google announced a migration to Google Neural Machine Translation, GNMT, which translated entire sentences at a time, rather than piece by piece, utilizing broader context to produce more natural translations. This neural approach led to dramatic improvements in translation quality. Today, Google Translate processes approximately 1 trillion words daily across various Google services, and it has become an essential tool for global communication, enabling people who don't share a common language to communicate and understand each other more effectively. 19. The Google Books Project, Digitizing Human Knowledge. 19.1 The Ambitious Vision. In 2004, Google announced the Google Books Project, an extraordinarily ambitious initiative to digitize the world's books and make them searchable. The project involved partnerships with libraries around the world, including partnerships with major research libraries at universities and the Library of Congress. The strategic vision behind Google Books reflected Larry Page's belief in universal information access. By digitizing books and making them searchable, Google could extend its mission of organizing information beyond what was available on the web to include the vast corpus of written knowledge stored in libraries. Page reportedly said that he wanted to make all books ever written searchable in Google Search. 19.2 The Implementation and Challenges. Digitizing books required significant logistics and operations. Google established scanning centers where books could be photographed and processed. Books from library collections were carefully transported to scanning centers, scanned using sophisticated equipment designed to capture high-quality images while minimizing damage to the physical books, and then returned to the libraries. The project was not without controversy. Publishers and authors raised concerns about copyright infringement, arguing that Google's digitization of copyrighted works without permission violated intellectual property rights. These legal challenges extended for years, ultimately resulting in a settlement that allowed Google to continue the project while providing compensation to rights holders for certain uses of copyrighted content. 19.3 Impact and Legacy. Despite the controversies, Google Books proceeded and eventually digitized millions of books in multiple languages. The project has made available for search and preview enormous portions of humanity's written knowledge. Researchers, historians, and learners worldwide have benefited from the ability to search for information across millions of digitized books. The project represents one of Google's most ambitious efforts to fulfill its mission of organizing information and making it universally accessible. Google's evolution toward artificial intelligence and machine learning. Early machine learning at Google. While Google's initial success was built on the PageRank algorithm, the company recognized early that machine learning and artificial intelligence would become increasingly important to its future. Google invested in machine learning research and development throughout the 2000s and 2010s, gradually integrating ML techniques into its products. Google's search algorithm itself became increasingly sophisticated through machine learning. Rather than relying exclusively on the PageRank algorithm, Google incorporated machine learning models that could predict which results users would find most relevant based on subtle signals. Google's advertising platform similarly integrated machine learning to improve the targeting and placement of advertisements. 20.2 Google DeepMind, and quantum computing. In 2014, Google acquired DeepMind, a UK-based artificial intelligence research company, for an estimated $400 to $500 million. DeepMind had achieved significant attention by developing AlphaGo, a machine learning system that defeated world champion Lee Sedol at the game of Go, a feat many believed was years away. The acquisition reflected Google's recognition that AI capabilities would be critical to the company's future. Google also invested in quantum computing research, establishing Google Quantum AI to explore how quantum computers might solve problems beyond the capabilities of classical computers. These investments represented Google's bet that artificial intelligence and quantum computing would be transformative technologies in the decades to come. Ahead, the COVID-19 pandemic and Google's response. Adaptation to remote work. When the COVID-19 pandemic struck in 2020, Google, like all technology companies, had to rapidly adapt to a remote work environment. However, Google's suite of products, particularly Google Workspace, formerly G Suite, positioned the company uniquely well to support remote work and collaboration. Google Meet, Google's video conferencing service, became essential infrastructure for millions of people working and learning from home during lockdowns. Google Classroom, which Google had developed for educational use, became critical infrastructure for remote learning in schools globally. Google Docs, Sheets, and Slides enabled collaborative work in ways that was difficult with traditional office software. Strategic advantages of the pandemic. While the pandemic created challenges for businesses globally, it also accelerated trends that benefited Google. The shift to cloud-based services, remote work infrastructure, and online communication platforms all drove increased adoption of Google's services. The company's investments in cloud computing, video conferencing, and collaboration tools proved prescient. Challenges, controversies, and the path forward. 22. Antitrust and regulatory scrutiny. 22.1. By the 2020s, Google faced unprecedented regulatory scrutiny globally. The U.S. Department of Justice filed antitrust litigation challenging Google's market dominance in search and arguing that Google engaged in anti-competitive practices. The European Union imposed massive fines for antitrust violations. Legislators and regulators worldwide questioned whether Google's dominance in search had created market power that stifled competition and innovation. These regulatory challenges reflected broader concerns about the power of large technology companies. Google was not alone facing antitrust scrutiny. Meta, formerly Facebook, Amazon, and Apple all faced similar challenges. But Google's dominance in search made it a particular focus of regulatory attention. As Google invested increasingly in artificial intelligence and machine learning, new privacy and ethical concerns emerged. The company's AI systems were trained on massive datasets of user information, raising questions about consent and data usage, concerns about algorithmic bias, and the potential for AI systems to discriminate against protected groups led to calls for greater transparency and oversight of Google's AI development. Looking forward, Google faces a critical inflection point. The company's dominance in search, the core source of its revenue, faces challenges from new technologies and competitors. Artificial intelligence systems like large language models have the potential to change how people access information, potentially bypassing search engines altogether. Meanwhile, regulatory pressures and antitrust enforcement create uncertainty about Google's future business model. Despite these challenges, Google remains extraordinarily profitable, controls enormous resources, and continues to innovate. The company's ability to adapt to changing market conditions will determine whether it can extend its dominance into the AI era, or whether it will face decline as technologies and user behaviors shift. Google's rise from a Stanford University research project to a company worth over $1 trillion represents one of the most remarkable entrepreneurial journeys in history. The company's success was built on several foundational elements: a genuinely superior technology, PageRank and subsequent search algorithms, a business model that aligned the company's interests with advertisers and users, exceptional execution and operational discipline, and willingness to invest in moonshots and adjacent markets. Yet beyond the financial success and market dominance, Google's story offers important lessons about innovation, strategy, and organizational culture. The company's "Don't Be Evil" motto, whether fully honored in practice or not, reflected a commitment to building something meaningful beyond simply maximizing shareholder wealth. Google's 20% time culture, an investment in speculative research projects, demonstrated that focusing excessively on near-term profits could limit long-term opportunity. The founders' insistence on preserving control through special share classes, despite taking the company public, showed how visionary leaders could resist short-term market pressures to maintain long-term focus. The acquisition of Android for $50 million and YouTube for $1.65 billion demonstrated the importance of recognizing strategic opportunities even when the initial price seems high. Google's expansion beyond search into email, maps, advertising, video, mobile operating systems, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence showed that a company with superior technological capabilities and deep understanding of users' needs can achieve remarkable growth. Needs could successfully expand across multiple markets. Today, Google faces new challenges from artificial intelligence, regulatory scrutiny, and changing user behaviors. The company's ability to navigate these challenges and continue innovating will determine whether Google remains dominant in the next era of technology or whether its dominance gradually erodes. Regardless of what the future holds, Google's rise from a Stanford dorm room to global technological superpower represents one of the defining business stories of the 21st century, filled with lessons for entrepreneurs, investors, and anyone interested in innovation and strategy.